Hi, friends. Welcome back to True Crime Echoes. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found us. This is the place where we sit down together and dive deep into true crime stories, real cases, real people, and the echoes they leave behind. Today's story is one that's haunted me ever since I first read about it. It's not just a murder case, it's a story about judgment, about the way society looks at women, and about how truth can get lost when scandal takes center stage. We're going back to New York in the 1960s to the case of Alice Crimmins, a young mother whose two children disappeared one summer night, and who would spend the rest of her life fighting not just the legal system, but the weight of public opinion. This case is heartbreaking, it's frustrating, and it leaves us with questions that still haven't been answered to this day. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let's walk through the story together. Chapter 1: A Summer Morning in Queens. I always find it unsettling when a story begins in the quiet of an ordinary morning because those are the moments when tragedy seems to hit the hardest. Imagine it, New York, July of 1965. The air is heavy with summer heat, the kind that makes you keep your windows open at night, hoping for the smallest breeze. In a modest apartment in Kew Gardens, a young mother walks toward the bedroom of her two children, expecting to start the day with breakfast and routine. Instead, she opens the door to silence. The beds are messy, the sheets still warm, but the children are gone. That mother was Alice Crimmins, a woman who would soon become the center of one of the most controversial and sensational murder cases in American history. What began as a desperate search for her missing son and daughter quickly transformed into something else, entirely a public trial of Alice herself. Not just as a parent, but as a woman, as a wife, and as a symbol of what society thought a proper mother should be. From the very beginning, Alice wasn't just treated as a grieving parent. She was judged for her appearance, for her choices, for the way she lived her life. The police, the press, even her neighbors seemed more interested in her lipstick, her clothes, and her relationships than in the fate of the children who had vanished in the night. And that is where the story becomes not only heartbreaking, but deeply unfair. To me, what makes this case so haunting isn't only the crime itself, but the way it exposes the biases of the time. It's about how quickly people turned their suspicions on a woman who didn't fit the mold, and how those judgments carried more weight than actual evidence. Before any body was even found, Alice had already been branded guilty in the court of public opinion. This is where our journey begins, with a mother waking up on a summer morning in Queens, stepping into her children's room and realizing her world will never be the same again. Chapter 2: The Making of Alice Crimmins. To understand the storm that would eventually swallow Alice Crimmins, I think it's important to step back and look at where she came from. Because when you peel back the headlines and the sensational coverage, what you find is a woman who, in many ways, was just like countless others of her time, caught between the traditions she was born into and the independence she desperately wanted for herself. Alice was born on March 9, 1939, in the Bronx, into a strict Irish Catholic family. That meant discipline, rules, and expectations. She attended a convent school where obedience and modesty were drilled into students. But Alice, even from a young age, was described as someone with a spark. She wanted more than the quiet, restricted life her parents laid out for her. She wanted freedom, her own choices, and a life that wasn't dictated by the church or by her family's rigid traditions. And back then, in the 1950s, the fastest way to break free from your parents' authority was often marriage. So at just 19 years old, Alice married her high school sweetheart, Edmund Crimmins. It seemed like the perfect match at first. Edmund was tall, handsome, and well put together, the kind of man people would say was a catch. Alice stepped into the role that was expected of her, a young wife, and soon a young mother. Within 2 years, they had two children. First, a boy, little Eddie Jr., and then a girl, Missy. They moved into the Regal Gardens apartments in Queens, and for a moment it might have looked like a picture-perfect family, a hard-working husband, a stay-at-home wife, and two children who filled the small apartment with life. But even in those early years, Alice didn't quite fit the image of the quiet, demure housewife. She cared about her appearance. She wore makeup, she dressed stylishly. She carried herself with a confidence that made her stand out. For many people in that era, a woman who looked glamorous every day was suspicious. It made them think she was vain, or worse, that she was looking for attention outside her marriage. But for Alice, makeup and fashion weren't about rebellion, they were about control. As a teenager, she had struggled with acne scars, and makeup became her way of shaping how the world saw her. It was armor in a sense, and she carried it into adulthood. By the early 1960s, Alice was in her mid-20s, balancing the exhausting routine of motherhood meals, laundry cleaning, raising two young kids. She did it all, but she also longed for something beyond the four walls of that apartment. Edmund, meanwhile, worked as an airline mechanic. He had a good job, but he spent more and more time at work or out drinking with friends. Home seemed like the last place he wanted to be, and that gap between them grew wider with every year. Alice felt neglected and lonely, while Edmund grew more suspicious and jealous. Their marriage was strained, but instead of talking about it or seeking help, Edmund began to watch Alice like a hawk. That was the start of a toxic cycle that would eventually explode into public scandal. It's important to remember, though, that at this point, Alice was still just a young woman trying to find her way. She had married young, had children quickly, and was trying to balance being a mother while still holding on to a sense of self. But to the outside world, those desires for independence, for freedom, and even for glamour would later be twisted into proof that she was dangerous, immoral, and even capable of murder. When I think about Alice at this stage of her life, I see someone walking a tightrope. On one side was the life she was expected to live, the dutiful wife and mother, quiet, obedient, never stepping out of line. On the other side was the life she wanted: more independence, more passion, more of her own identity. And what history shows us time and time again is that when a woman chooses to walk that line, she is rarely given the benefit of the doubt. That tension, that tug of war between who Alice really was and who society thought she should be, set the stage for everything that would come next. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Marriage. When we talk about marriages that fall apart, it's rarely because of one single event. It's usually a slow unraveling, a quiet buildup of resentment, loneliness, and small betrayals that eventually become too heavy to carry. For Alice and Edmund Crimmins, that unraveling happened in plain sight, but the story of how it broke apart would later be used against Alice in ways she could never have imagined. By the mid-1960s, Alice was in her mid-20s, still beautiful, still vibrant, but feeling increasingly trapped in a marriage that no longer offered her companionship. Edmund had become distant, spending long hours at work and even longer hours drinking with his buddies. Alice was left at home raising two children and watching her husband slip further and further away from her. It's easy for people on the outside to point fingers, but imagine being a young woman who had only ever been with one man in her life, suddenly realizing that maybe there was more out there. Alice admitted later that she grew curious. She wondered what it might be like to experience love, or even desire outside of her marriage. It wasn't unusual, it wasn't unique, but for a woman in the 1960s, those kinds of thoughts were dangerous. Edmund, on the other hand, didn't just sense the distance. He became obsessed with it. Instead of confronting Alice with honesty, he grew paranoid, convinced that she was unfaithful. His jealousy wasn't quiet, it was invasive, almost pathological. He bugged her phone. He ran wires through their apartment so he could listen in on her private moments. He even admitted to sneaking into the apartment while she was with other men, sitting in the basement listening to her through those wires. He wanted proof, but more than that, he wanted control. The picture of Edmund that emerges isn't just of a jealous husband, it's of a man unraveling in his own way. He was described as sneaking around Alice's belongings, touching her personal things. He later even confessed to behavior that was deeply disturbing, saying he exposed himself to young girls at a park. Later, he would claim he made that up just to make Alice feel less guilty about her own choices. But really, what kind of man uses something like that as an excuse? The truth is, Edmund was spiraling, and Alice was caught in the middle of it. During this period, Alice began working as a cocktail waitress. To us today, that may not sound scandalous, but in the 1960s, a married woman taking a job in nightlife was considered shocking, even shameful. Society expected her to stay home, cook meals, clean, and devote herself entirely to her children. By stepping outside that role, Alice was asserting independence, but she was also drawing judgment from everyone around her. And the thing is, Alice was attractive. Men noticed her, and she noticed them back. She went on dates she enjoyed herself, and she started to build a life that wasn't centered around Edmund. For him, this was unbearable. He couldn't stand the idea of other men being in her orbit, even though he was the one who had abandoned the marriage emotionally long before. What I find especially tragic about this stage of Alice's life is how ordinary it actually was. She wasn't doing anything that countless separated or unhappy women haven't done, trying to find herself again, trying to hold on to her youth, trying to fill the loneliness that had crept into her days. But Alice wasn't just any woman. She was a woman who would soon find herself in the middle of a nightmare, and every decision she made, every date she went on, every outfit she wore would be twisted into evidence of her guilt. As Edmund grew more hostile, he also began poisoning the children against their mother. He would speak badly about Alice in front of Eddie Jr. and Missy, planting seeds of doubt in their little minds. He painted her as reckless, as immoral, and as someone who didn't deserve them. And the more he tried to control the situation, the more Alice pushed for freedom. It all came to a breaking point one night when Alice left the children with a babysitter so she could go to a party with her wealthy boyfriend, Anthony Grace. It was supposed to be just one night out, but when Alice didn't come home, when the babysitter grew impatient and called Edmund for help that night, became ammunition. Edmund seized the opportunity, stormed in, collected the children, and began preparing for a custody battle. Looking back, that moment feels pivotal, because from that point on, everything Alice did was under a magnifying glass. She was no longer just a woman trying to navigate a broken marriage. She was about to become the target of a bitter ex-husband, a skeptical society, and a police force eager to prove her guilty of something much darker than infidelity. When marriages crumble, it's painful. But in Alice's case, that pain was only the beginning. What was coming next would change her life forever. Chapter 4. The Night. Everything changed. It was July 14th, 1965, just a week before Alice was supposed to appear in court for the custody battle Edmund had started. By this time, the tension between them wasn't just thick, it was poisonous. Every word, every action was watched twisted and stored away like evidence for the fight over their children. That evening seemed, at first, almost ordinary. Alice took the children out for a picnic in the park earlier in the day. She came home, made phone calls to her lawyer about the custody case, and picked up groceries for dinner. She cooked veal and beans, at least that's what she told the detectives later. Others would say she served macaroni. That small detail, veal or macaroni, would later spiral into one of the strangest debates in the case because the food in Missy's stomach didn't seem to match Alice's story. But on that night, it was just another family dinner. Afterwards, Alice bathed the kids, got them into their pajamas, listened to them say their prayers, and tucked them into bed. Eddie was 5, Missy was 4, still so small. She locked their bedroom door from the outside, a habit she claimed was to keep Eddie from sneaking into the kitchen at night. To modern ears, that might sound odd, even cruel, but back then to Alice, it was simply a way to manage her son's mischievous habits. Once the children were asleep, Alice got on the phone. She spoke briefly with her boyfriend, Anthony Grace. She also had a late-night call from another man, Joseph Rorick, who pressed her to meet him for a drink. She declined. The night stretched on quiet until sometime after midnight when Alice walked the dog and later ran herself a bath. Around 3 a.m, she got a call from Edmund, of all people, wanting to discuss the custody hearing. Who calls at 3 a.m. to talk about court? But still she answered, and when she hung up, she finally settled down to sleep. The next morning, everything was different. Alice went to unlock her children's door and found their beds empty. The sheets were messy, showing they'd been slept in, but the room was silent. The window was cranked wide open, though she swore she had closed it the night before because the screen had a hole in it. Panic set in immediately. She called Edmund, accusing him of taking them. He denied it. The two shouted over the phone, neither willing to believe the other. Then Edmund called the police. When detectives arrived, they didn't just see a mother in shock. They saw a woman who didn't look the part of the grieving parent. Her hair was neat. Her makeup was on her clothes, stylish. Instead of focusing on the open window or the fact that two children were missing, they noticed empty liquor bottles, a box of macaroni, in the trash, birth control pills, and brassieres in her bedroom. In their minds, all of this painted a picture not of a crime scene, but of a loose woman. From the very beginning, suspicion wasn't built on evidence. It was built on judgment. And in those critical first hours, so much was lost. Fingerprints weren't taken from the window frame, a stroller outside with an empty box wasn't processed, only a handful of photographs were captured of the apartment. The most basic investigative steps were skipped, and those mistakes would haunt the case forever. The detectives made a choice that day. They didn't see Alice as a victim, as a mother whose children were missing. They saw her as the prime suspect, and they never let go of that idea. It's chilling to think about. Two children vanished in the middle of the night, and instead of chasing every possible lead, the police zeroed in on their mother's lifestyle. In their eyes, her makeup, her clothes, and her boyfriends mattered more than the open window, more than the missing fingerprints, more than the desperate need to find Eddie and Missy alive. That morning was the moment everything changed. Not only for Alice, but for the investigation itself. From then on, the case was never really about the children. It was about her. Chapter 5: The Discovery. The morning the children were reported missing should have been the start of a full-scale search, the kind where every second counts. But instead, the investigation felt clumsy, distracted, even careless. And within just a day, the search for Eddie and Missy turned into something far darker. On July 14th, just hours after Alice had made the frantic call to Edmund, police discovered the body of 4-year-old Missy in a vacant lot not far from the Crimmins apartment. She was still in her pajamas, her tiny frame lying on her side, the top of her sleepwear twisted into a makeshift ligature around her neck. She had been strangled. What's most haunting to me is the way Alice was made to learn this. The detectives didn't sit her down, prepare her, or even break the news gently. Instead, they put her in a car and drove her straight to the lot without telling her why. Imagine stepping out of a car and suddenly finding yourself standing over the lifeless body of your daughter, surrounded by police officers, reporters, and flashing cameras. No warning, no privacy, no dignity. Alice fainted almost instantly when she realized what she was looking at. And still the detectives didn't see her as a grieving mother. They saw her as someone putting on a show. To them, her collapse was nothing but theatrics. Later, they would write in their notes that she hadn't cried in the car on the way back, as though shock, numbness, or disbelief were impossible reactions for a parent to have. Meanwhile, the media swarmed. When Alice stepped out of the police car back at her apartment, photographers captured her every movement. She had tears in her eyes, but those same detectives dismissed them as crocodile tears, claiming she was performing for the cameras. It's striking how quickly the narrative turned from a mother with 2 missing children to a woman on trial for her own emotions. And the tragedy didn't end there. 5 days later, little Eddie Jr. was found as well. His body had been left long enough that decomposition made it impossible to determine a cause of death. There was no ligature, no clear evidence, just the undeniable fact that another child's life had been cut short. To investigators, this became convenient, because without clear evidence, they could frame the story however they wanted. From the outside, it looked like a nightmare any parent would crumble under. But inside the investigation, the focus wasn't on finding out who had taken the children or who had killed them. It was on Alice, her face, her makeup, her social life, her every word and gesture. I can't help but think about the contrast here. On one side, 2 children are gone in the most brutal way. On the other, the adults who were supposed to bring justice were dissecting whether their mother wore too much eyeliner or whether she put on her high-heeled shoes too confidently. And somewhere in that gap, the real killer or killers slipped out of focus entirely. This was no longer just a search for the truth. It was the beginning of a witch hunt. Chapter 6: The Biased Investigation. If there's one thing that stands out in this case, it's how quickly the investigation turned away from the children and toward their mother. From the moment Missy's body was discovered, Alice wasn't treated as a victim, she was treated as a suspect. And everything that followed only reinforced that. The detectives walked into her apartment and took mental notes, not about clues that might lead to the killer, but about the alcohol bottles in the trash, the birth control pills on her dresser, the bras in her bedroom. They obsessed over her address book filled with men's names as though having boyfriends somehow meant she was capable of killing her children. It wasn't evidence, but they convinced themselves it was a reflection of her morality. And in their eyes, morality and guilt were one and the same. The investigation itself was sloppy. Fingerprints weren't taken from the children's window. The stroller with an empty box outside was ignored. There was a fingerprint at the scene that didn't belong to Alice or Edmund, but that didn't matter. It was brushed aside. Instead, the detectives decided almost from day one that Alice had killed her children. And if they didn't yet have proof, then their job was to dig until they found something, anything that could fit their theory. Alice's phone was tapped. Her movements were followed. Detectives trailed her to work, listened to her phone calls, and waited for her to slip. But what they got instead was something else conversations that revealed she was having affairs, that she was independent, that she was living life on her own terms. To them, this wasn't embarrassing, it was incriminating. They even went to her workplace and told her employers she was a promiscuous woman suspected of murdering her children. Not surprisingly, she lost her job. And that was the pattern. At every turn, Alice was punished, not for evidence of a crime, but for being the wrong kind of woman in 1965. A cocktail waitress, a woman who wore makeup, a woman who dated men, a woman who wanted to be free. These were the things detectives wrote down in their notes, the things the press ran headlines about, the things neighbors whispered. Meanwhile, Edmund's behavior, his jealousy, his spying, his bizarre confessions about exposing himself in public was treated as almost irrelevant. Witnesses said they saw him near the children's window that night, but investigators didn't pursue it. He studied polygraph tests in a library before taking one, then passed with flying colors, and no one questioned the strange preparation. The double standard couldn't have been more obvious. Then came the so-called witnesses. A woman named Sophie, a neighbor known for exaggerations, sent an anonymous letter claiming she had seen a man and a woman carrying children and a bundle that night. Later, when she was questioned, she changed her story, insisting it was Alice she had seen. Another man, Joseph Rourke, one of Alice's lovers, claimed that in a moment of frustration she had once said, "I'd rather see them dead than with Edmund." Whether it was hyperbole, sarcasm, or even something she never said at all, those words were treated as if they were a confession. Piece by piece, the case against Alice wasn't built on science or on hard evidence, but on innuendo and gossip. She became the subject of constant surveillance, relentless judgment, and a tidal wave of public shaming. The detectives convinced themselves that she had to be guilty, and so they shaped the narrative to fit. For Alice, it must have felt like suffocating under a weight she couldn't push off. She had lost her children, but instead of finding justice, she was now fighting for her own survival. And the truth, whatever it was slipping further and further away. What strikes me is how much this case says about that era. A woman who stepped out of line, who lived differently than expected, was fair game for suspicion. And in Alice's story, those suspicions weren't just whispered, they were weaponized. The investigation wasn't about solving a crime anymore. It was about proving a point that Alice Crimmins, the woman who dared to live on her own terms, had to be punished. Chapter 7. The First Trial. By the time Alice Crimmins finally went to trial in 1968, nearly 3 years had passed since the deaths of Eddie Jr. and Missy. 3 years of headlines that branded her a tramp, a sexpot, a cold and unfit mother. 3 years of whispers in her neighborhood. 3 years of detectives watching her every move. And 3 years of her life slowly unraveling under the weight of suspicion. The courtroom was packed from day one, not just with lawyers and reporters, but with curious onlookers who wanted to see this scandal play out in person. It wasn't just a trial anymore, it was a spectacle. The press described Alice's clothes, her makeup, the way she chewed her gum. They called her a manhunter, a cocktail waitress turned femme fatale. And it wasn't subtle. The prosecution leaned into that image, making her lifestyle the centerpiece of their case. The jury was made up entirely of 12 white men. Conservative, middle-aged, exactly the type to look at a glamorous, independent woman and see danger instead of strength. Alice didn't stand a chance with them, and she probably knew it. As witnesses began to testify, it became clear that the trial wasn't about solving a murder. It was about dismantling Alice's character piece by piece. Joseph Roerich, one of her former lovers, took the stand. He told the court that Alice had once said she'd rather see her children dead than let Edmund have custody. He even claimed she had confessed to him, whispering through tears, "Joseph, forgive me, I killed her." Alice erupted in court. She shouted at him, begged him to stop lying, cried out that it wasn't true. But her outburst didn't win her sympathy. To the jury, it made her look unstable, and if Joseph had lied, and many believed he had, it didn't matter anymore. His words carried the weight of a confession, while Alice's emotional denial was dismissed as theatrics. Then came Sophie the neighbor, whose anonymous letter had first caught investigators' attention. By the time she testified, her story had shifted so many times it was hard to keep track. Yet on the stand, she told the court she had seen Alice that night carrying a bundle with a man by her side and a boy walking nearby. Sophie's performance was dramatic, her words vivid, and the jury seemed to hang on everyone. Alice couldn't hold herself back. Again, she jumped up screaming at Sophie, calling her a liar. To me, that reaction feels human. How could anyone stay calm while being accused of murdering their own children? But in that courtroom, her anger and grief were treated as proof of guilt, not innocence. And the prosecution. They didn't have physical evidence. No fingerprints, no witnesses who actually saw her harm her children, no scientific proof tying her to the crime. What they had was a narrative, a woman who wore too much makeup, who dated too many men who wanted freedom more than she wanted to be a mother. They painted her as selfish, immoral, and cold. They told the jury she was capable of anything, and the jury believed them. After 13 days of testimony, the verdict came down. Guilty, not of murder, but of first-degree manslaughter in Missy's death. The weight of that word guilty was enough to crush Alice. In fact, she collapsed into a coma after the verdict, her body literally shutting down under the shock. She had to be hospitalized before being transferred to prison. It's heartbreaking to think about. This wasn't justice. This wasn't closure for Eddie and Missy. This was punishment for Alice being the wrong kind of woman in the wrong era. A woman who laughed too loudly, wore her skirts too short, and lived her life outside the narrow lines society had drawn for her. The trial should have been about the children, about what really happened to them that summer night. But instead, it became about Alice, her choices, her appearance, her defiance. And in the end, that was enough to seal her fate. Chapter 8. The Second Trial. If the first trial of Alice Crimmins was a spectacle, the second one was a full-blown drama. By 1971, 6 years after Eddie Jr. and Missy were killed, Alice was back in court. This time the stakes were even higher. She wasn't just facing manslaughter. She was facing murder. The world had changed a lot in those 6 years. The late 1960s had given rise to the women's liberation movement, and suddenly the idea of a woman choosing her own path didn't seem as outrageous as it once had. There were people who saw Alice differently now, not as a monster, but as a woman being punished for her independence. Still, the shadow of her first conviction loomed heavy over her, and the prosecution wasn't about to let go. The second trial pulled in many of the same characters, like actors returning for a sequel. Joseph Roerich once again took the stand, repeating his story that Alice had confessed to him. Sophie the neighbor returned with her dramatic account of seeing a woman carrying a bundle that night. And just like before, Alice couldn't contain herself. She shouted, accused Sophie of lying, begged her to tell the truth. It was raw, it was emotional, but it also played right into the image. The prosecution wanted the jury to see a woman who was unstable, defensive, unpredictable. There were new witnesses, too. One of them, a woman named Tina DeVita, claimed she saw a man, a woman, a child, and even a dog walking near the Crimmins apartment that night. Her story seemed to support Sophie's, but her sudden appearance raised more questions than answers. Who was she? Why hadn't she come forward before? It felt shaky. But in a courtroom desperate for drama, it gave the prosecutors another thread to weave into their story. Then came a surprising twist. A man named Marvin Weinstein testified that he had been out late that same night with his family, his wife, his young children, and their dog. He said that he had been carrying his daughter wrapped in a blanket. Could it have been his family that Sophie and Tina had seen from their windows? His testimony poked holes in the prosecution's case, but in the end, it wasn't enough to shift the tide. The trial once again leaned heavily on Alice's personal life. Prosecutors dragged out her affairs, her work as a cocktail waitress, her love of makeup and stylish clothes. They weren't just painting her as guilty, they were painting her as unmotherly, immoral, unworthy of sympathy. And the judge, he refused to limit those attacks. Even when Alice's lawyers argued that her sex life had nothing to do with her children's deaths, the door was left wide open for the prosecution to use her choices against her. Alice's lawyers tried to fight back. They pointed out the inconsistencies in Sophie's stories, highlighting how her original anonymous letter didn't even mention Alice by name. They questioned whether anyone could truly hear whispered conversations from 200 feet away, as Sophie had claimed. They even brought up her fragile mental health, including a past incident where she had overdosed on pills. But no matter how hard they tried, the image of Alice as the cold, selfish mother was already burned into the jury's minds. When the verdict came, it was devastating. Alice Crimmins was found guilty of first-degree murder in Eddie Jr.'s death and first-degree manslaughter in Missy's. She cried out in court, begging for mercy, insisting she hadn't killed her children. But her words fell on deaf ears. To me, what's most chilling about the second trial is how little it actually added to the story. No new evidence, no new breakthroughs, just the same shaky witnesses, the same judgments, and the same obsession with Alice's lifestyle. It wasn't about truth. It was about making sure she paid. And so she was sent back to prison, her life shattered once again. But the question lingered, the one nobody seemed to want to ask. If Alice didn't kill her children, then who did? Chapter 9. Life After Prison. Alice Crimmins' second conviction could have been the end of her story. A woman locked away for life, remembered only as a tabloid villain. But her case wasn't that simple. Legal battles, continued appeals were filed, and courts went back and forth on what exactly she should be guilty of. At one point, her murder conviction for Eddie Jr. was overturned. Her manslaughter conviction for Missy was reinstated. She went in and out of prison as appeals wound their way through the system. It must have felt like living in limbo. Not free, not truly imprisoned forever, just trapped in a cycle of courtrooms, judges, and endless waiting. And through it all, Alice carried the weight of a label she could never shake: child killer. By the mid-1970s, Alice was granted parole. She had served more than enough time by then, and technically she was free. But freedom for Alice didn't look like freedom for most people. Her face had been on the front page of newspapers for years. Her name was synonymous with scandal. Wherever she went, she was recognized. People whispered, pointed, judged. She wasn't Alice the woman anymore. She was Alice Crimmins, the infamous mother on trial for her children's deaths. She tried to build a life outside of prison. She married Anthony Grace, the wealthy contractor she had dated back when everything first began. It should have been a new beginning, but even then the press followed. Pictures of them on yachts appeared in tabloids, fueling outrage that a woman convicted of killing her children was allowed to enjoy anything at all. Politicians even weighed in, some arguing she should never have been paroled in the first place. It was as though the world wasn't interested in letting her move on, and Alice, for her part, stayed silent. After years of speaking out, shouting her innocence, and being ignored, she seemed to realize that nothing she said would change public opinion. So she slipped into the background, avoiding interviews, avoiding the spotlight, trying to hold on to what little privacy she could salvage. But the tragedy of Alice's life isn't just that she spent years in prison. It's that the deaths of Eddie and Missy were never truly solved. No other suspects were seriously investigated. No new evidence was ever uncovered. Edmund, with all his disturbing behavior, was barely scrutinized. That fingerprint at the scene that didn't match Alice or Edmund forgotten. The witnesses who swore they saw Edmund near the children's window that night ignored. And so the story remained frozen. Alice bore the blame, while the truth, whatever it was, slipped away into the shadows. What I find haunting is how Alice's punishment didn't end when she left prison. It followed her for the rest of her life. She wasn't just convicted by a jury, she was convicted by society. Every headline, every cruel nickname, every sideways glance kept the stigma alive. Alice Crimmins tried to live quietly after her release, but in the eyes of the world, she was never allowed to be just a woman again. She would always be the mother accused of killing her children. And whether she was guilty or innocent, the fact remains Eddie and Missy were gone, and the mystery of what really happened to them was never solved. Chapter 10. Closing Reflections. When I step back and look at the story of Alice Crimmins, I can't help but feel that what we're left with isn't justice, it's a tragedy, layered on top of another tragedy. Two young children lost their lives in the middle of a hot summer night in Queens. That alone should have been the focus. Every ounce of energy, every investigative resource should have gone into finding out who was responsible. But instead, the case became a trial of one woman's morality. From the very first day, Alice was judged not for what there was evidence of, but for who she was. She wore makeup, she worked in bars, she had boyfriends. She was independent in a time when independence from women was seen as dangerous. Those things became her evidence. And in the eyes of the police, the press, and ultimately the jury, they were enough to brand her guilty. Meanwhile, the actual investigation was riddled with holes. A fingerprint that didn't belong to Alice or Edmund was tossed aside. Witness statements pointing to Edmund near the apartment were ignored. No photographs of crucial evidence. No scientific trail to follow. The most basic steps that could have brought clarity were missed, or maybe neglected. And because of that, we may never truly know what happened to Eddie Jr. and Missy. Alice herself paid the price both in prison and in the years that followed. Even after she was paroled, she was never free. She was never just Alice. She was the woman on trial in the court of public opinion for the rest of her life. And what's most painful is that we don't even know if she was guilty. To this day, people are still divided. Some believe she got away with murder. Others believe she was a victim of a sexist witch hunt. The truth is locked away with the children who never got justice. For me, this case is about more than Alice. It's about how society chooses its villains. It's about how women, especially women who live outside the mold, are judged more harshly than anyone else. And it's about how in the noise of scandal and gossip, the real victims, Eddie and Missy, were pushed into the background. Their lives, their stories deserved better. So what do you think? Did Alice Crimmins kill her children, or was she punished for daring to be different in a world that wasn't ready to accept her? This case leaves me unsettled, because after all the trials, all the headlines, all the years, the only thing that's certain is that 2 children died, and no one truly answered for it. That's the story of Alice Crimmins, a mother, a suspect, a woman whose life was defined by tragedy and judgment, and a case that still leaves us with far more questions than answers. And that's the story of Alice Crimmins, a woman branded guilty in the eyes of society long before any jury delivered a verdict. A mother whose life was consumed by scandal, and 2 children whose deaths remain a mystery. What do you think? Was Alice truly guilty, or was she the victim of a witch hunt, punished for being different in a world that demanded conformity? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please share them in the comments below. If you found this story as unsettling as I did, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next case we explore here on True Crime Echoes. These stories are heavy, but they're important because they remind us of how easily truth can be overshadowed when society decides who to blame. Until next time, take care of yourselves, make good choices, and stay safe out there. I'll see you soon with another story.